another time we saw him in Vegas. RZA got into some with Tyreek. Got his chain snatched, got punched in his mouth, got beat, no, got wrestled up a little bit. Got real funky. It was a club. It got real rowdy, and Pac got his chain back.
Wow.
You know what I'm saying?
And RZA got his he got his whooped in there. Where they ended up snatching his chain while they were whooping his, right? And he's outnumbered. No disrespect to the Wu-Tang guys.
Any artist out there want to be an artist and want to stay a star, don't want to have to worry about the executive producer trying to be all in the video, all on the record, dancing. Come to Death Row.
August 1995, New York City. The Source Awards set the stage for a coast-to-coast standoff. Suge Knight threw shots at Puff Daddy, but all eyes weren't just on Bad Boy. They were also on Wu-Tang. 9 men from Staten Island, their presence was heavier than most labels. In 1996, at Suge Knight's own club 662 in Las Vegas, Wu's RZA was jumped, his chain ripped away, a direct insult on death row turf.
I remember dragging him, but the whole time he hollering, "They got my chain, they got my chain, man, they got my chain."
Word spread fast, and Old Dirty Bastard's fiery warning made it clear, this guy's not leaving New York alive. This wasn't a feud, it was a powder keg. Let's dive in.
This is a situation that has something to do with, two crews, 2 rival teams. We know Puff and them was creaming them back then. And Death Row, at that time they was doing they shit. So you know how it go.
The mid-1990s were one of hip-hop's most volatile years. Every headline screamed East Coast versus West Coast. Every interview seemed to pour gasoline on the fire, and behind the music there were real lives at risk as gang wars were almost unavoidable. Suge rose from Compton, California. He began as a promising football player, then as a bodyguard, and eventually as one of the most feared music executives of his time. In the early 1990s, he co-founded Death Row Records, which later became the powerhouse label of the West Coast. Under Suge Knight's direction, Death Row launched the careers of Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and later Tupac Shakur. To many, Suge was an embodiment of both the glamour and the danger of the West Coast scene. Suge did not only build his empire through business acumen, but also through intimidation. The internet went wild with stories of his ability to control artists and rivals alike, an attribute which portrayed him as a man who always got what he wanted. Meanwhile, out of Staten Island, the Wu-Tang Clan were rewriting the rules of rap, 9 voices building an empire that didn't answer to anyone. And while the spotlight stayed fixed on Bad Boy versus Death Row, there was another story unfolding, a quieter one, but just as dangerous. It was the near collisions between Suge Knight and the Wu-Tang Clan. The group was led by Robert Fitzgerald Diggs, better known as RZA, whose vision was to create not just a rap crew, but a brand, a philosophy, and an empire. Alongside him were GZA, Old Dirty Bastard, Method Man, Raekwon, Ghostface Killah, Inspectah Deck, U-God, and Masta Killa. Although each of them had their unique style, together they formed a collective so large and powerful that most fans thought they were impossible to intimidate, not even by Suge Knight or his Death Row Records.
Everybody got this thing like, yo, we imbeciles. You know what I mean? Yo, the is gonna jump on your back and bite you in the neck and this and that. And then when they get to meet us, it's like, damn, y'all some real respectable, loving guys.
By the time Wu-Tang Clan's debut album, Enter the Wu-Tang, 36 Chambers, dropped in 1993, the landscape of hip-hop was forever changed. Despite that, the album was raw, unpredictable, and unpolished, yet it felt more authentic than anything the East Coast had produced in years. Wu-Tang's immediate success rattled not only their local rivals in New York, but also executives across the country. It is widely assumed that Suge Knight was paying close attention to what was happening in Staten Island, because Wu-Tang had done something nearly impossible, as they had taken control of their own destiny while refusing to be controlled by the industry's biggest players. Where solo rappers might have bowed, Suge Knight's pressure, Wu-Tang thrived as a brotherhood. Now, talking about the clash between Wu-Tang and Suge Knight, the iconic scene that stirred everything up took place in Madison Square Garden, New York City, during the 1996 Source Awards. The Source Awards had become the the most important night in hip-hop. Trophies were handed out, yes, but more than that, reputations were made, statements were broadcast, and entire movements were put on display. That night, Suge Knight took the stage to accept the Best Motion Picture Soundtrack Award for Above the Rim. With the whole industry watching, he delivered one of the most infamous shots in hip-hop history when he said on stage that any artist out there that want to be an artist and want to stay a star and don't want to worry about the executive producer trying to be all in the videos, all on the record, dancing, come to death row. It was a direct attack on Sean Puff Daddy Combs, head of Bad Boy Records. The room erupted. Some cheered, others booed. East Coast rappers stared daggers at Suge, while West Coast crews clapped in solidarity. But here's the overlooked part. Wu-Tang was there that night. They weren't in the feud, but they weren't invisible either. Wu-Tang performed Ice Cream, Raekwon's single, and Method Man later won an award for How High with Redman.
But it's the image. So to me, the image was taken out of proportion and made it be this and made it be that, instead of it actually really being that situation.
Members of the clan would later recall the energy in the room. Raekwon said it felt less like a celebration and more like a battlefield with cameras. He explained, it wasn't no East Coast-West Coast war, it was two crews, two rival teams. The media just blew it up. Wu-Tang's decision that night was crucial, and that was to stay neutral. They didn't align with Bad Boy, despite both being East Coast. They didn't align with Death Row, despite Method Man's friendships in California. They carved their own lane. But neutrality didn't mean weakness. Everyone in the building knew that if things spilled into the streets, Wu-Tang could hold their own. Their reputation stretched from New York blocks to Cali corners. Affiliates carried weight in the streets, and Suge Knight, who built his empire on intimidation, knew it. What many don't realize is that Suge wasn't just an enemy maker, he was a businessman. And by the early 1990s, Wu-Tang was a business opportunity, as he eyed them and wanted them to be part of Death Row. Journalist Ronan Rowe reported in his book, Have Gun Will Travel, that Suge Knight made unsuccessful moves to sign the Wu-Tang Clan, or at least some of its members. By 1996, Method Man joined Tupac and Thaw Dog Pound on Got My Mind Made Up from the Diamond-certified All Eyes on Me. However, that song, also featuring Redman, omitted a recorded verse from Inspectah Deck. While the Death Row Squad was the commercial juggernaut out of the gate in the early 1990s, Wu-Tang eventually found sales and mainstream recognition to match their critical acclaim and certified hip-hop approval. For Suge, bringing Wu-Tang under Death Row would have been a power play. It would have been an East Coast credibility, 9 different artists with solo careers, and the ability to rival Puff's Bad Boy. For Wu-Tang though, the deal was a non-starter. They had their own blueprint. RZA's vision was clear, and that was the fact that Wu-Tang would be their own dynasty, not someone else's soldiers. But the very fact that Suge Knight reached out spoke volumes. He didn't dismiss them. He respected them. He saw them as equals, or threats, maybe more of threats, as the unspoken tension between them was brewing.
A couple months earlier, one of they that got, he was in our club, 662, and somebody snatched his chain, put hands on him. We got the chain back and found that bitch. That's love. And I went to Method Man like, yo, we handled that, man. We want to talk to you. That was never our orders.
By 1996, Death Row Records was sitting at the top of the industry. Suge Knight had transformed his label into an empire, a cultural force, with Tupac Shakur's All Eyes on Me dominating charts and Snoop Dogg carrying the West Coast sound worldwide. On the other side, Wu-Tang Clan had released Wu-Tang Forever, proving their debut was no fluke. The album went multi-platinum and cemented their legacy as leaders of the East. It became a thing of deliberation and diverse opinion in those years, that the music industry became a chessboard, with Suge and Wu-Tang as two powerful pieces that never directly collided, but always seemed to hover just near each other. Tupac Shakur, meanwhile, complicated the dynamic. Suge Knight brought Pac into Death Row as its star, but Pac had roots in New York and respect for Wu-Tang's artistry. It was rumored that Pac was a low-key admirer of Method Man and RZA, and fans think that admiration made Suge Knight uneasy. If Pac respected Wu-Tang, it meant Death Row couldn't treat them as just rivals. After the Source Awards, whispers started to circulate. Stories claimed that Suge Knight sent his men to intimidate Wu-Tang at a New York industry event. Nothing ever happened. But the rumor itself spread like wildfire. The most dangerous brush between Wu-Tang and Death Row came not in New York, but in Las Vegas. 1996. Club 662 was Death Row's playground. A Vegas nightclub, Suge Night held court. One night, ERASED, Wu-Tang's mastermind, was assaulted and his chain was snatched on Death Row turf. That was more than a robbery. That was disrespectful.
A couple months earlier, one of they had got, he was in our club, 662, and somebody snatched his chain, you know, put hands on him. We got the chain back and found that nigga. That's love.
But before things could erupt, Pac intervened. According to Wu-Tang member U-God, Pac tracked down who had the chain. He confronted them, got the jewelry back, and personally returned it to RZA. Pac reportedly told RZA that if he wanted revenge, he'd arrange a one-on-one. And here's the key. Pac made it clear this wasn't a Death Row move. They were rogue actors, not sanctioned by Suge. In fact, Pac scolded Suge Knight's men for even daring to mess with Wu-Tang on his watch. Members of Wu-Tang later brushed it off. Ghostface Killah recalled how Old Dirty Bastard, unpredictable and fearless, reacted to the chatter. Dirty, never one to hold his tongue, allegedly said, "This guy's not leaving New York alive." The crew had to pull him back. They knew ODB was capable of turning words into action. Cooler heads prevailed, not because Wu-Tang was scared, but because they understood the stakes. One violent night could ignite something bigger than anyone could control. It was a what-if moment. What if Dirty hadn't been checked? What if Suge Knight's men had actually stepped up? Hip-hop history could have taken a bloodier turn. Method Man would later tell the story of one of the strangest encounters of his life during a Soul Train Awards after-party in Los Angeles, early 1996. Meth admitted he was on mushrooms, seeing the world through a haze. He described watching Puff Daddy acting suspiciously friendly, and then bumping into Pac and Suge Knight. Meth recalled that. Pac walked right up to me. He brought up some incident with RZA in Vegas, saying if he'd been there, it definitely wouldn't have happened.
Somebody tapped my shoulder, I turned around, it's Pac. He there with Suge. Now the whole time Pac is talking, I can't concentrate.
He's telling me about some incident that happened with RZA in Vegas, and if he was there, it definitely wouldn't have happened, blah, blah, blah.
Then he looked at me and said, if there's anybody we would fick with on the East Coast, it'd be Wu-Tang.
If we with anybody on the East Coast, it'd be y'all Wu-Tang nigga. With y'all Wu-Tang.
The words were a lifeline. Pac was making it clear that Wu-Tang wasn't the enemy. This wasn't an East Coast versus West Coast thing. It was Bad Boy versus Death Row. And then there was Suge. Meth remembered him standing there, silent, cigar in hand, face blank. No smiles, no threats, just stone. To Meth, it felt like a performance. Suge played the role of boss while Pac handled diplomacy. It was tense, it was weird, and it could have gone left at any second. But Pac's respect for Wu-Tang was obvious. And in that moment, it probably kept things from spiraling.
And I remember looking up, and Suge was like this with a cigar in his mouth, looking down at me like this. Nothing, no expression, just you know what I mean? Stoic, because the cameras is on. He in Suge mode, and so I'm like, yeah.
Reggie Wright Jr., former Death Row head of security, later confirmed the story. For him, it was proof of Pac's role as a peacemaker, not just a soldier in the East-West War. Think about it, how one stolen chain could have ignited a full-scale conflict between Death Row and Wu-Tang. But Pac, in the middle of his own war with Biggie and Bad Boy, still took time to protect Wu-Tang's name. That's respect.
Backstage, Tupac said he was ready to battle Death Row's East Coast nemesis, the people from Bad Boy Records.
They see us and they want drama, we gonna definitely bring it like only Death Row could bring it.
Likewise, the 1996 MTV Video Music Awards in New York City wasn't just another award show. It was a moment that felt like the entire hip-hop world was holding its breath. The West Coast was in the house with Tupac Shakur, Snoop Dogg, Suge Knight, and the full Death Row entourage. The East, also strong, had Wu-Tang Clan, fresh off their rise as the most respected collective in the game. To outsiders, this might have looked like a night of glitz, cameras, and celebration, but for those who understood what was really at stake, it felt more like two armies arriving at the same battlefield, except under the blinding lights of live television. The air inside Radio City Music Hall was loaded with heat and tension. The glances between felt like a move on a chessboard. In fact, some described it as a standoff happening in slow motion. But more interestingly, the fact that nothing happened that night made it unforgettable. At the 1995 Source Awards, Suge Knight Knight had already taken aim at Puff Daddy, sparking the now legendary coastal rivalry. Although Wu-Tang performed that night too, they didn't get involved in the drama. They chose to focus on their music. A month later, the VMAs brought the industry back to New York. Death Row and Tupac were there. Fresh off the chaos of Hit 'Em Up, Wu-Tang was there too, with Method Man and Old Dirty Bastard in the building. The VMAs, though, were different. The stakes were higher, the stage was bigger, and the entire country was watching. This was the night Pac famously had a peace meeting with Nas backstage, but no drama popped off between Wu-Tang and Death Row. If anything, it underscored the line Pac had already drawn. Bad Boy versus Death Row was the real fight. Wu-Tang wasn't in it. Old Dirty even went out of his way to say in interviews that he loved both Biggie and Pac. His plea was simple: the violence gotta stop.
But we always felt like we wasn't a part of it because we had respect from Death Row. We had respect from Bad Boy. Like I said, it was just a competitive sport back in the 90s that had everybody going bonkers.
Then came the night that changed everything. September 13th, 1996, Las Vegas. Neon lights flickered off chrome bumpers and casino signs, but on the strip, the energy was darker than usual. Tupac Shakur, Death Row's crown jewel, had just left the Mike Tyson fight at the MGM Grand with Suge Knight riding beside him. Hours later, only blocks from Club 662, the same club where tensions with Wu-Tang had already been tested, Pac's BMW was lit up with gunfire. 4 bullets tore into his body. 6 days later, he was gone. The rap world stopped, and in that silence, everything shifted. Death Row, once untouchable, began to unravel almost immediately. Days after the shooting, Suge Knight was arrested on parole violations, caught on camera throwing punches in the Tyson fight melee. Without Pac, without Dre, who had already walked away, Death Row looked less like an empire and more like a collapsing tower. The invincible image of Suge Knight started to crack. But for Wu-Tang Clan, the tragedy was more than just a news headline. It was a warning. They had seen firsthand how close things had come to spiraling into an all-out war. When RZA was jumped in Club 662 and his chain was snatched, that insult could have exploded into coast-to-coast violence. ODB's furious threats made it clear Wu-Tang would not tolerate disrespect. Yet, somehow, the line was never crossed, and Pac's death made the reason clearer than ever. And that is the fact that the balance had always been fragile, always one incident away from destruction. Looking back, it's almost chilling to imagine the alternative. What if Wu-Tang had retaliated in Vegas? What if Death Row affiliates had pushed harder in New York after Suge Knight's Source Awards outburst? Picture it. 9 hardened MCs from Staten Island, many with real street ties, FBI files, and crews behind them, going head-to-head with Suge Knight's blood-affiliated army of enforcers in Los Angeles. The body count would have been devastating. The headlines would have fueled the East Coast versus West Coast fire until it burned the entire culture down. Hip-hop was already bleeding. Biggie would be killed just 6 months after Pac. Adding Wu-Tang versus Death Row to the chaos, the golden era could have ended in ashes, and yet it didn't, because Wu-Tang refused to be pawns. RZA, always the chess master, knew better than to let outside forces dictate their moves. They stayed focused on building an empire. Wu wear clothing, solo albums under one brand, and global tours. They didn't need to prove themselves in a war that wasn't theirs, because Suge Knight, for all his ruthless intimidation, recognized Wu-Tang's power. This wasn't just another rap crew. These were 9 generals commanding an army of affiliates from Shaolin to Brooklyn. Even Suge Knight knew starting a war with them was bad business. And because Tupac himself drew the line, when RZA's chain was snatched in Vegas, Pac personally stepped in, made sure it was returned, and told Wu-Tang the beef wasn't with them. He respected the clan. He knew the difference between a rap war and mission. Pac made sure Suge let it go. That respect, that restraint, changed everything. When Wu-Tang dropped Wu-Tang Forever in 1997, their double disc opus, they didn't celebrate Death Row's collapse or Pac's death. They mourned the state of hip-hop. Songs like A Better Tomorrow and Impossible were less about disses and more about loss, unity, and survival. They weren't throwing gasoline on the fire. They were trying to keep the culture alive. Meanwhile, Suge Knight sat behind bars, and Death Row began eating itself alive. Snoop Dogg defected. Dre built Aftermath aftermath, Pac was gone, and Suge's empire rotted. The streets had shifted, but even as the smoke cleared, respect between Wu-Tang and Death Row's remaining players never fully disappeared. Corrupt of Thaw Dog Pound, in his infamous 1999 diss track calling out names, went after nearly every East Coast rapper, but he stopped short of Wu-Tang, calling them family. It was a subtle but powerful statement. Wu-Tang was never the enemy. Years later, the connections grew even stranger. Raekwon signed with Dre's Aftermath, long after Dre had split from Death Row, and recorded tracks for a project that showed lingering mutual respect. Killah Priest, a Wu-Tang affiliate, linked up with Corrupt and other West Coast MCs for the supergroup HRSMN. What once looked like sparks for war turned into unlikely collaboration. Wu-Tang came out of the 1990s, bloodied but alive, while Bad Boy lost Biggie and Death Row lost Pac. The clan managed to sidestep the worst of the violence. Their neutrality wasn't cowardice. It was strategy. They understood that power didn't always come from pulling the trigger or firing back on wax. Sometimes, the greatest strength was knowing when to let the smoke pass. ODB's unhinged threats, Meth's tense encounters with Suge and Pac, RZA's chain snatching, all of it could have been the spark that lit a coast-to-coast inferno. But time and again, Wu-Tang pulled back, choosing empire over ego. That choice saved them. And so the question lingers. What if? What if Suge Knight really had gone to war with the Wu-Tang Clan? It's almost unimaginable. Death Row soldiers and blood affiliates on one side, Wu-Tang and their Staten Island crews on the other hand, dangerous enough to against a record label. Club 662 wouldn't have been just one chain snatching. It could have been a massacre. The Source Awards wouldn't have ended in awkward stares. It could have been a riot. And the golden age of hip-hop, the very years that gave us Enter the Wu-Tang, 36 Chambers, All Eyes on Me, and Ready to Die, might have ended in blood. Instead, what hip-hop got was survival. What hip-hop got was Wu-Tang Forever. In the end, the story of Suge Knight and the Wu-Tang Clan isn't about war. It's about the war that never came. It's about how, in the deadliest years of rap's history, two of the most feared forces in music stared each other down, brushed against the line, and chose not to cross it. And that decision gave us something rare in 90s hip-hop, a victory, not for Death Row, not for Wu-Tang, but for the culture itself, because the war never came. And maybe that's the only reason we can still say, to this day, Wu-Tang is forever.